Scotland today, and there's a lot more that we could talk about Scotland, but I thought it might also be helpful if we considered what was it like to be in England in particular, but the same would be true of Scotland. And that is, what was the church like in England before the Reformation? Because I don't think we can appreciate what the Reformation did in our English speaking fathers unless we know how dark it actually was. So Ken Gillespie last week gave to me a book by J.C. Ryle called The Five English Reformers. And it included the quote that I kind of massacred. And that is, we talked about the beginning when there was Reformation taking place, and two of the earliest martyrs were Bishop Hugh Latimer and Dr. Nicholas Ridley. Do you remember me talking about them being burned? And Cranmer was placed in his cell and made to watch them burn. All right, so this is what Latimer said to Dr. Ridley as they were lighting them on fire for their Lutheran beliefs. "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." And they were executed. Wow, that's the kind of people that you want to take take note of and follow. Well, the English religion before the Reformation, Ryle takes some data given by a man named Hooper. And I've listened to Carl Trueman's lectures on the Reformation in England and in Scotland, and he makes two individuals to be kind of the more cowboy-like, cavalier folk, and that is Hooper and Knox. And so this is some information that Hooper gives as he was kind of chronicling what took place when he entered into a particular area. It's, I think the way to say it is Gloucester. You may read it and it looks like Gloucester, but it's, I think, pronounced Gloucester. We have a town by the same name down east. But in 1551, he recorded Gloucester, the diocese, had 311 clergy. So those would be officially ordained clergy members of the Roman Catholic Church. Now it would be the Anglican Church because it was just sort of a straight takeover. He said that the records indicated 168 couldn't repeat the 10 commandments. 31 of this 168 couldn't tell you where the 10 commandments came from, and 40 could not tell you where the Lord's Prayer was written. 31 out of this 40 could not tell you the author of the Lord's Prayer. He also said that religion in the English-speaking world at the time, so this is before the Reformation, so you're talking about late 15th century, early 16th century, it was grand and base superstition. It was marked with sort of this, grand and base superstition marked English religion. Some illustrations. A vial of blood was shown to the saints who came to the Abbey of Hales. An abbey would be a name for like a church building of sorts, or you might call it a chapel. And so if you came to your local church and it was the Abbey of Hales, the priest would show you this vial of blood, and they told you that it was Christ's blood. And for a certain number, certain donation, you could receive the benefits of the blood of Christ being applied to you. Well, when King Henry VIII took over, and then they had a council that was doing research to find out about the state of religion in England. They found out that that vial of blood was actually duck's blood that was replaced every week. Another example, there was a crucifix in Kent that was able to change the expression. So a crucifix, this would be what Roman Catholics would wear. Do you know the difference between what Protestants might wear a cross, Roman Catholics wear crucifixes? Do you know the difference? What? That's right. So Jesus is on the crucifix. All right. So this is a big picture of a crucifix at Kent. And if you gave copper, the face of Christ on the crucifix would be grave or serious or stern. If you gave silver, it would relax his expression. It would be less stern and grave. If you gave gold, he smiled. And then under King Henry VIII's time, they found out that wires were connected to the crucifix's face that the priests were able to control on the basis of what you gave. There was another church building, and the priests there, they had a thread that was said to be from Mary's girdle, that if you were a woman in delivery, you could pay for a thread from the girdle to be given to you for the safety of your child. That is incredibly cruel. There was, and this is where Ryle goes into a more elaboration. Clergy in particular were scandals. They were taken from the lowest moral class, and by that I just mean the individuals of society who had the lowest moral standards would be recruited into the clergy. They had lower standards than the laity within England. It was impossible to find worse. This is Ryle. Ryle says it's impossible to find worse examples of immoral clergy in the whole history of the Roman Catholic Church than in the English-speaking church before the Reformation. Ryle reported that the clergy were that they would absolve any sin if you had enough money. They created sanctuaries in the religious buildings for criminals who paid enough money. Sexual immorality was especially the mark of the clergy, such that the monasteries and the nunneries were houses of iniquity. So Ryle did not even, one of the things he says in this book, Ken, let me look at, is that he would not even describe the actions that took place in the monasteries and the nunneries so as not to defile the conscience of his reader. In the way that that you would associate a brothel, a house of ill repute, would be what took place in these monasteries and nunneries. During Henry VIII's commission to investigate the condition of the church when he took over the church, monasteries, quote, manifested sins, vicious, carnal, and abominable living was daily used and committed in abbeys and other religious houses of monks and nuns. Now, Ryle does make some, I think, helpful observations for us. A soul famishing for the word of God must not be judged too harshly if it struggles to find comfort in most groveling superstitions. So in that sense, if you think about the woman who was giving birth and who would pay, such that the supposed thread from Mary's girdle would be given to her, or individuals who would give of their money so that the crucifix might smile upon them. Like, we could, in one sense, mock them or scoff at them. And I think Ryle, he helps us to see what if you and I famished for God's word, and these people provided some kind, though a superstition, but some kind of hope you would probably latch on to that. I think this is an accurate understanding of what we are like if we do not have the Word of God. Ryle then says this as it pertains to the immorality that marked nuns and the clergy: abstinence, idleness, and luxury fuel immorality. And that was what described to be a priest at the time. Ryle writes, take any number of men and women, any nation, rank, or class, bind them by a vow of celibacy, shut them up in houses by themselves, give them plenty to eat and drink, and give them nothing to do, and above all, give them no Bible reading, no true religion, no preaching of the gospel, no inspection, and no check from public opinion. And this is what you'll get. So this is really what was the mark of religion in the English-speaking world before the Reformation. Now think what took place in 100 years. Some of the men, if you stay, we're going to read from a Puritan book. If you think about the height of Puritanism, which was like from 1560 to 1640, I think that's really like the height of Puritanism. How can you go from this description to what you can read? Like, the Puritans are, in one sense, a treasure trove of biblical pastoral care that are unmatched, and at least in my limited experience, by another portion of church history. In 100 years, this kind of change was brought about in English-speaking people. That's just amazing. It is amazing. And I just wonder, how did God do that? Right? This is the story in part of how God do that, at least as we consider Scotland. As you remember what I told you about Scotland, what do you remember when you're thinking about the enemies and the friends of Scotland before the Reformation in Scotland? Do you remember how we tried to have some understanding of the historical enemies and historical allies of the Scottish folk? All right, take a guess. Who is Scotland's historic enemy? England. All right, the British. England was they were the historic enemy. Who was the ally to the Scots historically at this point? The French. Right. So that was all at least debatable at the time that England broke from Rome. Right. So that's going to be a significant feature, and it has significantly shaped Scotland up into this day. Scotland, the Protestant doctrines were received in Scotland in a unique way among the nobles. The first Scottish martyr was a man born of noble birth whose last name is Hamilton. I think his first name is James, but I could be wrong. And so what happens when the noble classes are now suffering great loss for the sake of religious doctrines? What do you think the consequence of is when you see a noble born man to be executed because he holds to Protestant doctrines? Think about, like, what's the social, cultural effect?
The church has a lot of pull.
Okay. If you see a rich man not just suffer some loss, but lose even his life for his religious beliefs, what does that say about his religion? Yeah. Everybody in that sense will say this is very serious, right? So there is, in one sense, in Scotland, the nobles actually take attraction to Protestant doctrines in a noted way. University students also were especially attracted to Protestant doctrines in Scotland. Protestant books were smuggled into Scotland that promoted the cause, indicating if you're going to have books, who then are you going to influence? This is really a plain, straightforward question. That's right. So there is a relationship that we need to understand about education and the Protestant Reformation. And that is, if the information is going to be coming by way of literature, then it's only those who have access to literature and can read the literature that are going to be affected. Trickle down comes through preaching to those who are illiterate, and most were illiterate. Right? So that's one reason that we can understand that this is having some traction with the nobility and the university students. But we also have to remember, what is the nature of society? It's decadent. It is incredibly dark morally. In 1542, James V dies, and Mary Stewart, an infant, takes the throne. Struggle for power emerges between Henry V and those in Scotland. Catholics sent Mary to France. All right, Mary who? Stewart. How do you spell it? Stuart. So that's the French spelling of Stewart, as opposed to the other spelling, Stewart. All right, so Mary Stewart, there's lots of Marys. It's very easy to get them confused. All right, she is the Scottish queen, and she's Catholic. She's also got a French mother. So they sent her to France.
She did spell her name the first way, started the English way, and then changed it to the French way once she went over to France.
Did she? I don't know that fact. I've only seen her name spelled this way, so I don't know the history of if it was spelled another way. You might be right there, Chris. Have you heard that? Okay. So she goes to France for her education, and also the goal is that she marry a French prince. At this point, I think you remember that there are some who are saying that Scotland should go with the English, and then others who are saying Scotland should remain allied to the French, and so they're called Francophiles. That means you would be for the French ally, or you would be an Anglophile. That means you would be for England as your ally. And so there's this struggle for power and the direction of Scotland. Now, why do you think some might have an attraction towards becoming Anglophiles? Now, what's a base? Like, just think through it. Like, think about carnal, worldly men. But England has broken from Rome. What's the consequence of England breaking from Rome? Think mainly as like crass men. England broke from Rome. England now has its own church. What do churches, especially at this time, but what do churches have? What do they possess? Okay. Money, and especially money that's wrapped up in land. All right. So there was, in one sense, a power grab for the nobles when you're thinking like, oh, you mean we can run the church? And so likewise, you would imagine nobles in Scotland could look at the scenario in England and think, wait a second, all of the assets that the church in Rome has in Scotland, which were astronomical, those could be divvied up among Scottish folks. So would you see like that might make an ally with England now attractive to, a base motivated nobleman, right? So that's an ingredient when you think about these dynamics in the Reformation. The other would be is what do you have to pay to the church if you are a country that's connected to Rome? Tax. You're going to be taxed. Right. So if you change like England did, now the tax dollars sort of stay in your country. So there you could see why some nobles were attracted to allying with England at this point. Well, a war broke out between these two groups. Did we go over this? The war that broke out? All right. Well, this is fantastic. This is really interesting. There's lots of little details that I wish we could get into, but we're kind of skipping along the history. So a war breaks out. And again, you have these two groups, the Anglophiles and you have the Francophiles. Remember that you have nobles that are involved in this. All right. This is not just sort of like when you thought of Luther's peasant rebellion. That's not what what we mean when we say a war broke out. Nobles allied on the different sides, and they would raise up a militia or an army. And so Protestant resistance took form and captured St. Andrew's Castle, and they killed the archbishop. So in that sense, you have to also think, whoa, all right, this is what we're talking about when we think about the Reformation in Scotland. Blood is involved pretty quickly, and there's definitely some mixed motives among the different players. Well, the French sent an army to capture it back and to punish the rebels, but the Protestants withheld the siege. Among the Protestant conspirators of St. Andrews was a nobleman. He was a friend of a Protestant preacher, George Wishart, and had an educated priest by the name of John Knox as a tutor to his son. So you see the connection? A nobleman was one of the supporters of the Protestant cause within Scotland. He was a friend of George Wishart. George Wishart was a Protestant preacher within St. Andrews. And so George Wishart was the dominant preacher in St. Andrews at the time. And this nobleman sent John Knox, tutor to his sons, to St. Andrews to take his sons there. So John Knox goes to St. Andrews as it has been conquered by the Protestants to tutor this nobleman's sons. Knox had planned to go to Germany, so he didn't plan to stay there. But once in St. Andrews, it became apparent that Knox was to be appointed and approved by the Protestants within the St. Andrews to become their preacher to the community of Protestants there in St. Andrews. Now, there's a lot of stories to this, and I think I'll embellish some. This was not Knox's ambition. When it was actually during the worship meeting that the preacher announces to the people directly to John Knox. It would be like this: Tim Horner, God has called you to preach. All right. So he's doing it publicly. Knox leaves the meeting and goes to his room. And what I read, he was like in there for over a day. And eventually his answer is something like, I should not walk a road that the Lord has not called me to. So he's saying there has to be an official external call of the church for me to take up this. Well, obviously that can be remedied. And so there was the congregation actually declared that they wanted Knox to be their preacher. Now, I have all kinds of questions like, so does that mean the Scottish Reformation at one time was congregational? It seems like it is. I haven't asked any scholar about that, but my reading of what took place there at St. Andrews was it was a congregational approval of Knox to be their preacher. And so when the community of saints there did it, Knox now became the Protestant spokesman for reform in Scotland, right? So that is the event that crystallizes John Knox as the Protestant preacher, spokesman, leader for the Reformation in Scotland.
What location? What church?
It would have just been within St. Andrews. St. Andrews was a castle. So have you been to St. Andrews? Okay, so if you go there now, you would need to see St. Andrews was a castle. This was within St. Andrews, so there was only one.
Geographically, what area? Would that be Glasgow?
It's St. Andrews. But where?
Geographically, the place is called St. Andrews.
So it's going to be in eastern Scotland. So, but it is St. Andrews. That's the name of the location. I don't know my geography of Scotland well enough to place it in relationship to Glasgow, but I think Glasgow is eastern Scotland. Is it? The reason I know it has to be on the east is because the French came by way of ship to St. Andrews. So St. Andrews is on the channel there. And so at this point, France sends a stronger army, and they take St. Andrews back. The Protestants surrender, though it was illegal. The French take Knox and others as galley slaves on the French ship. They lied about this, all right? So when they took them, it was under false pretenses, and they just made them galley slaves for 19 months. Now, galley slave was a death sentence. So that's the other, that's the thing that you need to understand about being made a galley slave. You didn't live, you died being a galley slave. So Knox is a galley slave for 19 months. Edward VI eventually is able to negotiate for the release of a number of prisoners, which includes Knox. All right, this particular time, there's a number of stories that you could tell, but this one is, I think, a picture of what Knox is like. The French would come down to the galley, and you know, a galley is like, so you're rowing, all right? So you're rowing, that's how you're moving the ship. And so the slaves are more or less just propulsion. And so they're under, they're not up high, and they're chained, right? So they're not free. And so the French would come down, and they would have, they would conduct mass on Saturdays, and they had an image of Mary. And so they would force the Scots to kiss the image of Mary. Well, they brought it to Knox. Knox tells a story. Knox wrote a history of the Reformation in Scotland, and he is telling the story, and he doesn't say it's him, but people say Knox is narrating this, and he is the one that he is referring to in the third person. And so they present the image of Mary. Now, Knox believes the mass is idolatry, right? And we'll eventually maybe develop what Knox did is, all right, so idolatry is the sin that one commits if they take the mass. If they do any kind of worship towards Mary, it is the sin of idolatry. Knox was well read when it came to his Bible, and he understood what God commanded his people to do in relationship to idolatry. And so when they present this image of Mary to Knox to kiss, all right, so that's what they're like, kiss. And I can't remember in French what they would call Mary. And so Knox somehow gets the image in his hand and throws it into the sea. And he said, she is light enough. Let us see if she can swim for herself. And he said, after that, no Scottish lips were laid to that idolatrous. Can't remember how he phrased it. All right. So that is, I think, a fair picture of this man has fight. This is not a man who yields. And so never again did they actually do that. So Knox is a uniquely sturdy and courageous leader. This will mark Knox throughout his ministry and his life. When he was released, he went to Europe, and when in Europe, he went to Switzerland, and there he met Calvin and Zwingli and Bullinger. During this time, he made illegal trips back to Scotland to encourage the Protestants there. In 1558, Mary marries the heir to the French throne, Mary Francis. She's 16 years old. She's the next queen of France. She's the next Queen of Scotland, and she also is claiming to be heir of England. 1558 was also Mary Tudor's death and Elizabeth's rise to the throne. Mary Stewart claimed to be the rightful Queen of England when Elizabeth took the throne. So you can now begin to see the tension between England and Scotland, between Queen Elizabeth and Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland. So she's called Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. Mary Stuart's mother ruled in her place while Mary, Queen of Scots, remained in France. So they called that a regent. All right. So she was the regent ruling in the authority of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, who remained in France. She ruled as a Roman Catholic. She had Romish policies, and but at the time, the Protestants made a covenant with themselves to serve, quote, the very blessed word of God and his congregation. Right. So there is this rise of an organization of Protestant resistance against Mary Stuart's mother reign. They saw their cause as similar to the English Protestants and established ties with them. In 1558, lords of the congregation ordered themselves into a church and asked Knox to return. Right, so now what would that be? If you declared yourself to be a congregation under the regent saying that you cannot have a congregation, how did this church form? Legally or illegally? Right? Illegally, according to the ruler of the day. Well, at this point, Knox had recently published a book. All right. It's referred to as the last blast of the trumpet. And it was Knox's, it was his book exposing the sinfulness and all of the sins related to Bloody Mary's reign. All right. So he wrote it, and it was aiming at Bloody Mary. Well, when it's published, guess who's queen? Not Bloody Mary, Queen Elizabeth. Right. So when you think about timing of publishing, Knox publishing of the last blast of the trumpet is considered one of the most historically mistimed publishing dates ever. All right. So that now sets Elizabeth, if you might remember from last week, she was pro-Protestant. And so Knox now alienates himself from a potential ally in England because of the publication of the last blast of the trumpet, because he's arguing against women in roles of leadership, not only in the church, but in the state. And so he makes an argument that says that this is a sign of sort of evil overcoming. And the reaction is you must take it as sin. All right. So she's not really won over by Knox's book. And so Mary's mother sent for French troops to come to put down the Covenanters. The Covenanters asked for England to help them. But remember, what did Knox just publish? So they only gave limited resources to the Covenanters. Knox, however, was their preacher. He was their spiritual leader during this time. In 1560, Elizabeth does send troops to assist the Protestant Scots, and a long war seemed to be certain. All right, so they're digging in. France is sending their troops. Queen Elizabeth is sending troops. The noble lords that have sided with the Protestants, they're Protestants, all right, they're digging in using their resources. All right, so it seems like Scotland is about to engage in a long war between these Protestants and Catholics, the French and the English, but Mary's mother dies. That's one of the things you see in church history. People just die. The Lord takes their life. And it has incredible consequences when God chooses to do this. I think we can pray those things. We can pray, Lord, would you just take out this person? I mean, just think. just like Herod, right? God can just immediately take out these rulers. Well, he takes out Mary's mother. And so France now decides, I think we'll seek peace. And so that's the French and the English troops leave. And so it seems as if the Protestants have an opportunity now, but guess what happens? This is a constant problem with the Scots. What do you think the Scot leadership does? Do you know any Scots? Do you happen to be Scottish? I can assure you this is probably what your family does too. They divide. All right, so the opportunity to actually dig in and make some ground is thwarted because they fall out. The Scottish lords fall out with one another. All right, throwback to Braveheart. All right, William Wallace. All right, that the lords will not unite because they're greedy. The same thing took place. The Scottish lords fought with one another over property, and Knox and his men fought for reform. So an illustration would be they ended up having an agreement where they divided up the assets and the tax into three parts. 2/3 went to the Roman Catholic Church. The other third was divided among the lords, and then half of it was given to Knox's cause, which were education, the poor, and the new church. And so Knox's comment of, well, 2/3 went to the devil, and 1/2 of the other third also went to the devil. So that's just the way Knox was. He called it as he saw it, and he saw it typically in black or white. So it's a tragic disappointment when you come to the history of Scotland, including the Reformation of Scotland, is that the nobles cannot get along and they're just interested in personal gain. Now, add to that injury this insult. They're disagreeing with one another. They're fighting with one another over property. And the nobles now ask Mary Stewart. Who is she? Mary, Queen of Scots, the Roman Catholic, the French, at least half French queen. They ask her to return to rule. And so she agrees, and she returns in 1561. She was disliked, but she was followed by her Protestant half brother, James Stewart. And so he becomes, in one sense, a counselor to Mary Stewart. Right? Mary Stewart and John Knox did not get along. Now, there are some things we need to know about Mary Stewart. And if you see any movie or any secular presentation of John Knox and Mary Stewart, they're going to spin Mary Stewart as if she is this young, fragile, but beautiful queen. And John Knox is this rough, harsh man. And what I have read is that John Knox seems to be like 5'2", 5'3", and Mary Stewart is 6 feet tall. She is beautiful. She is intelligent. She is articulate. She is shrewd, but she is immoral. Right? So John Knox is direct. He is blunt. He sees things very straight, and he is courageous. Right? But the way that this is sort of spun by a lot of secular histories is not at all accurate. Mary celebrated the Mass privately in her personal chapel, and Knox preached that she was Jezebel and an idolater. You can imagine that they didn't get along too well. The lords, now notice, right? So the lords who called her back, they were Protestant, but they call back the Roman Catholic queen. Like, how weird is that? All right, the lords did not follow Knox and were content with a Catholic queen. right? So Knox was not interested in any kind of substandard pragmatic reform. Knox was after Protestant Reformation in Scotland. The so-called Protestant lords were fine if they had a Catholic queen. And so they were not with Knox when it came to his vision for reform. Knox and his followers, however, started the Reformed Church of Scotland at this time. And this is the prototype of what would become Presbyterianism, which became eventually the official Church of Scotland. In Presbyterianism, or in the Reformed Church of Scotland, elders were elected, and so was a minister. So, you can remember Calvin. Do you remember Calvin's contribution to church government as he was seeking reform in Geneva? What was Calvin's significant contribution to the organization of the church in Geneva? All right, it was this board of pastors. They didn't call it an elder board. They didn't call it a presbytery. All right, but it was the consistory. Right, that was these pastors. All right, Knox is taking that, and he has a version of it, and the version is you have elders that are elected. Again, we're going to like, whoa, that's pretty dramatic. Not appointed, they are elected. And it also is that they a minister. So there's a distinction with Knox's Reformed Church of Scotland between ministers and elders. If you know anything about the Presbyterian Church, do you know how they talk about the two different kinds of elders in the Presbyterian Church? All right, you have a preaching elder and a ruling elder, right? So the minister would be the preaching elder. There's a distinction that they make there. Ruling elders are not necessarily ministers. Right, so this prototype really is developing what would become fixed within Presbyterianism. The minister had to be first examined by the other ministers as opposed to the elders. All right, that's another aspect. It's a mark of Presbyterianism. We probably won't get into it, but when the Scots-Irish immigrated to the United States, like there was one particular band of them that I am a descendant from. They settled on the Petey River in Upper South Carolina, the Cape Fear River here in our state. And the first thing they did once they sort of eked out an existence for a year is they called a qualified, educated minister from Edinburgh. So just imagine. I do think some values here are pretty helpful for us to consider. And that is to think like you've just sort of won some kind of victory. You've just established, in one sense, a Reformed church. What do you put your priority on? What do you put your highest value in? What did the Reformed Church of Scotland do? Where did they place this first mark of emphasis? On their elders, on their ministers. I do think we need to make sure we catch that lesson from the history of the Protestant Reformation. What is the emphasis of modern evangelical Protestantism? What are some of the emphases? The music, the band. What else?
Attraction.
Right? What attracts? Right? Which all of those sound very similar to what? What other sort of sector of our society? Entertainment, business. I would say one thing that we should pick up from the study of church history is how to be able to identify the problems with the contemporary evangelical Protestant church in our society. Leadership, qualified biblical leadership is the first point of emphasis when you are establishing churches. That is what Knox does here. So they are working out the leadership. So they have ministers tested by other ministers, and they have elders that are elected. And that is the structure of leadership. They wrote a confession, the Scots Confession. They wrote a book of discipline, and they wrote a book of common order. Imagine how those would sell today. Here's our book of common order. Here's our book of discipline. Here is our confession. Wouldn't sell to modern American evangelical Christians. They're not interested in the church. They're interested in themselves and their feelings. Mary Stuart's pride and her lust brought down her rule and her life. Mary Stuart desired to be Queen of England. In pursuit of this lust, she married her cousin Henry Stewart to increase her claim to the throne. Who's on the throne at the time? Who's her rival half-sister? Elizabeth, right? She wants Elizabeth's throne. She claimed, even when Elizabeth took the throne, that she was the rightful Queen of England. So she marries her cousin Henry Stewart to increase the claim to the throne. She is rejected still. She goes to battle with her Protestant brother, declaring to sit on London's throne. She then marries he's a nobleman, and she has him blown up. Or I was listening to a book Douglas Wilson wrote, a biography of John Knox, and so my details may be slightly off, but it's helpful. She marries this man, and it's like a celebrity. He is tall and handsome and attractive and noble. She, as I've told you, is also tall and intelligent and beautiful and attractive. So this is like, your celebrity wedding. And like most of these celebrities, they have horrible marriages. And so eventually he begins to drink himself to death, and he's an embarrassment because of his behavior and drunkenness in the court, which is probably saying something like, how drunk do you have to be an embarrassment to the immorality that exists in the court? Well, that's what he did. And so they do have a son, quite significant historically. It's James. And so they have a son together. Well, eventually their marriage is a total wreck, and so they're not together. But while she is pregnant with James, she is alleged to be having an adulterous affair with this Roman Catholic Italian that she has brought to Scotland, and her husband sets up for him to be murdered. He hires a hitman, but he wants the hitman to have the Italian Roman Catholic that she is allegedly having an affair with to be murdered in front of her. She's pregnant with his son. And so the hitman takes place. And so in the very presence of Queen Mary of Scots, this Italian Roman Catholic man is murdered and thrown out the window. So that's what it was like at the time. Well, she somewhat pulls things together, but she then gets into another affair with the military leader that she also brought to Scotland, and he was a very scandalous man. He, however, was a womanizer. He was a fornicator. He was an adulterer. And so he enters into an adulterous affair with Queen Mary of Scots, such that she has already had an affair, but she is traveling in the country, and he with his troops are also out in the country, and he comes and by force takes her. We'll just let the adults understand what we mean by that. And so now by law, they have to marry. And so but that's a problem. She has a husband. Well, the military fellow who she is having an affair with seems to be the one who arranges while James is giving birth. While she is giving birth to James, he goes over to another home, another area that they have rule of, and he is there because he has syphilis, and he's dying from syphilis there. But she goes to see him. So this is towards the end when James is to be born. She goes to see him to comfort him, supposedly. And when she leaves, there's an explosion and he dies. And so she marries this military man. All right, that's Mary, Queen of Scots, Mary Stewart. Well, when she marries the man, this military fellow, all right, that's sort of the last straw for the Scots. They rebel, and she now is forced to abdicate or be killed. And thus her son James, this is King James, whom we will have our Bible, English Bible dedicated to, he now becomes the ruler of Scotland. She was imprisoned, and her half brother, Moray, comes to rule over Scotland. He is a Protestant. She, however, escapes. She raises a Roman Catholic army only to be defeated by her half-brother's troops. She now flees to England to be protected by her rival, Elizabeth. Elizabeth receives her with greater courtesy than you would expect of a usurper to her throne. And though she restricts Mary, Queen of Scots, to the, well, no longer Queen of Scots, but she restricts Mary Stuart to the castle, she is allowed to go freely among the castle. She is commanded, they are commanded to treat her as a queen. She is given a 30% servant team. That's the way Elizabeth treats Mary when she flees to England. However, Mary decides to conspire against Elizabeth 3 times. She's caught, and on the 3rd one, she is proven guilty and executed, though she does face her execution with dignity that was expected of a royal. So that's Mary, Queen of Scots, right? So that's significant, because now back in Scotland, you have her half brother reigning as regent in place of, or instead of King James. Knox supports Moray, but resistance is continuing against the Protestant cause. And so at this point, Knox suffers a stroke, and he had to retire from his public role in active life. Once more, Knox makes a return to the pulpit after his stroke, after St. Bartholomew's Massacre in France, which was, have you heard of St. Bartholomew's Massacre? Right, there was a time where the French come into Paris. They're promised that they're going to be given safe treatment, and in a moment it all changes, and so there is a huge massacre of the Huguenots, the French Protestants. So Knox sees this as a necessary time for him to return to the pulpit and to exhort the Scots to continue their struggle and their suffer for the Protestant cause in Scotland. If they do not, Knox admonishes them, they will suffer the fate of the Huguenots in France. And then Knox dies. So the Protestant Reformation in Scotland had now been born, right? So all of this is sort of the history to how did Protestantism make inroads in Scotland. You see, it's different. It's different than what took place in England. It wasn't the monarch changing. You see, it's different than what took place in Switzerland in these cities or cantons. It's different than what took place in Germany or Saxony with Luther. And so there's a lot more of the regency, the queen, the relationship between England and Scotland that takes place. And as we go to talk about Puritans, as we go to develop Puritans, you'll need to have this as your background, because part of what we're going to learn about Puritans is not going to make sense to us if we have our preconceived notions about the church to understand what were the Puritans and what did they aim to do, right? So not next week. We won't have this class next week, but after Thanksgiving week, we will look at the Puritans. So, but this is sort of the birthplace of Protestantism within England and Scotland that does come to produce the Puritans, which came to found in significant ways our own country, and I think are a unique contribution of all of the Reformation in the books that we have from the Puritans. Any comments, questions about the Reformation in Scotland? There really is so much more. I'd really love to go into John Knox in particular, but I'll have to reserve that for another time. Okay. I have a few questions for you. Who is familiar with Protestantism in England and Scotland after this period? All right. Like, who are some figures that you do know about? Drop some names. Okay, he's before this. Yeah, I'm thinking afterwards. Who are figures that you know something about or have read who are after this? Could be some of the Puritans. Okay. Baxter, Owen, who's the third? All right, Thomas Brooks, Watson, Flavel, Sibbs, all right. Owen was mentioned. We got to throw in our Baptist Puritan, Bunyan. All right, so I'm asking just to see like what you might be familiar with, because there's lots of differences within the Puritans. So that might be helpful for us. Okay. No questions. All right. I would like to, we don't have this book, but if you were going to buy one book, I would suggest Michael Reeves' The Unquenchable Flame. It's pretty thin. It's really fun to read. It's really easy to read. It is well done. Michael Reeves' The Unquenchable Flame. So, Chris, would you close us in prayer?